The woman in the torn white dress stood in the middle of the frozen road and did not move. That was the first thing Victor Blackwood did when he realized Evelyn was gone. He sent men after her. Not out of love, not out of concern. He sent them the way a man sends someone to retrieve a piece of furniture that is rolled off a wagon. He stood in the doorway of his mansion in his silk robe, holding a glass of brandy he had not yet bothered to drink, and told his foreman, "Find her and bring her back before morning. I don't care what condition she's in." He did not ask if she was cold. He did not ask if she was bleeding. He said condition the way you talk about livestock. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be owned by another person, not just controlled, not just manipulated, but owned the way a man owns a horse or a piece of land, this is that story. And if you've never had to ask yourself whether you would have the courage to climb out a second-floor window in a wedding dress with no shoes in the middle of a Montana winter, I want you to sit with that question for a moment, because Evelyn Whitmore did exactly that. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Stories like this one take real time and care to bring to life, and every subscription helps us keep going. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and your comment means more than you know. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Nathan Walker had not spoken Evelyn Whitmore's name out loud in almost 2 years. Not because he had forgotten it. He remembered it the way you remember the name of a town you drove through once on a hard trip, present somewhere behind the ordinary thoughts, surfacing without warning at inconvenient moments. The name appeared when he was splitting wood on cold mornings. It appeared when he sat down at the table and saw only 2 plates instead of 3. It appeared, most reliably, in the hour just before sleep, when a man's defenses are down and the things he refuses to think about during the day come drifting back like smoke. He had built a story around her absence, and the story was simple. She had chosen not to come. She had written him letters for months, careful, thoughtful letters that told him she was real, that she meant what she said, that the life he was offering was one she genuinely wanted. And then the letters had stopped. No final letter, no explanation, no word at all, just silence, stretching from one week into the next until it was clear that silence was the answer. Nathan had concluded, after a great deal of painful consideration, that Evelyn Whitmore had looked at what he was offering and decided it wasn't enough. A struggling ranch in Montana, a widower with a young son, a man who didn't have much except the land under his feet and a willingness to work hard. She had looked at all of that, weighed it against whatever else was available to her, and quietly chosen something better. He did not blame her. That was the part that sat the worst with him. He truly did not blame her, which meant there was no one to be angry at, which meant the whole thing just sat inside him like a stone that had no place to go. Oliver was 5 now. He'd been 3 when the letters stopped. He didn't remember the period of anticipation, the weeks when Nathan had let himself believe that things were going to change, that the ranch was going to have something it had been missing since Clara died. Oliver only knew the life they had, him and his father, and Walter Hayes and the 2 horses, and the long Montana winters that came in like a fist and didn't let go. It was December. Nathan had gone into Billings for supplies and was coming back in the wagon when the snow started. It came in fast, the way it did up here, shifting from light to heavy in under an hour. And Nathan was pushing the horses harder than he liked because the temperature was dropping and the road through the ridge pass was the kind of road that became genuinely dangerous once ice set in beneath fresh powder. He almost didn't see her. She was standing in the middle of the trail, slightly off-center, her arms wrapped around herself in the way people hold themselves when they have been cold so long that holding themselves is just something the body does automatically, not because it helps. He thought for one lurching, irrational second that it was a trick of the snow, that his eyes were making something out of nothing, the way the eye does in low light when it starts filling in shapes from its own inventory. Then the horses slowed without him asking them to, because horses know things before people do. And Nathan saw that she was real. A woman. White dress. No coat, no shoes, no anything except the dress, which had been torn somewhere along the left side and was hanging wrong. Her feet were dark against the snow. Not dark from shadow, dark from blood. Nathan was off the wagon before he'd made a conscious decision to move. I was in the road, crossing the distance between them. his boots punching through the top layer of ice crust with each step, and he was already reaching for her, already thinking hypothermia, frostbite, she needs to get warm right now. When she lifted her face and he stopped. He stopped the way you stop when the ground disappears under you. The sudden lurching stop of a man whose body understands something before his mind does. He knew that face. He didn't know how. He had never met her. There was no logical reason for his body to recognize someone he had never stood in the same room with. But he had a photograph. One small photograph she had sent with her third letter, slightly blurred the way photographs were in those days, showing a woman standing in front of what looked like a porch railing, squinting slightly against some light source just outside the frame. He had looked at that photograph more times than he would ever admit to another person. He had put it away in a drawer after she stopped writing. He had not thrown it away. She looked at him and her mouth moved. No sound came out at first. Then, with the particular effort of someone who has been rationing their strength and is spending the last of it on this one thing, she said his name. Nathan. Not Mr. Walker. Not the formal address of a stranger, just his name, in a voice that sounded like someone coming back from somewhere very far away. Nathan Walker stood in a Montana snowstorm and looked at the woman who was supposed to have arrived at his ranch 2 years ago, and he did not say a single word. He just reached out and caught her before she fell. He got her into the wagon bed and covered her with the blanket he kept behind the seat for exactly this kind of weather, Montana cold being the sort that could kill you on a clear day if you weren't prepared. She did not speak during the ride back. She drifted in and out of something that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite consciousness. And Nathan drove faster than was strictly safe because the alternative was worse. Walter was in the barn when the wagon came in. He came out when he heard the horses, squinting against the snow. And then he saw Nathan carrying a woman toward the house, and his expression went through several stages that Nathan clocked even in his urgency. Surprise, then confusion, then something else that didn't quite resolve before Nathan had his back turned. "Heat up some water," Nathan said, "and find Clara's old blankets, the heavy ones, in the trunk in the back room." Walter didn't ask questions. That was one of the things Nathan had always respected about him. The man knew when questions were for later. Oliver was asleep, which was fortunate. Nathan settled Evelyn on the settee closest to the fireplace and wrapped her in the blankets Walter brought, and he cleaned her feet himself, working as carefully as he could, because what he found when he looked at them was bad enough that his jaw tightened and stayed that way. The cuts were deep. The cold had slowed the bleeding but not stopped it, and there was bruising up along her ankles that looked older than tonight, bruising that had been developing for some time. She was awake enough to flinch, not awake enough to pull away. It took the better part of an hour before the shivering slowed. Nathan sat in the chair across from her and waited, because there wasn't anything else to do, and because some part of him needed to see her awake, and certain before he started asking the questions that were already filling every inch of available space inside his head. When her eyes finally focused and held, when the glassiness of extreme cold began to clear, the first thing she said was, "I didn't stop writing." Nathan looked at her. "I need you to know that," she said. Her voice was steadier now, though still rough. "Before anything else, I need you to know I didn't stop writing." He thought about the photograph in the drawer. He thought about the last letter she had sent, which had talked about the route she was planning to take, the date she expected to arrive, how nervous she was about meeting Oliver. He thought about the weeks after that when he had watched the road every day. "What happened to you?" he asked. She didn't tell him everything that night. She couldn't. She told him enough. She told him the shape of it, the broad facts that explained why she was in his road in a torn wedding dress in December. And then the exhaustion that had been waiting behind her effort simply took over, and she slept. Nathan sat awake until well past midnight, listening to the fire and the wind, and tried to make the shape of what she had told him fit inside his understanding of the last 2 years. Her name was Evelyn Whitmore. She was 28 years old. She had grown up in St. Louis, which she described not with warmth, but with the flat tone of someone describing a place they survived. Her father had a printing business that had been failing for years, held together by debt and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. When she had seen Nathan's advertisement in the St. Louis Register, seeking wife for frontier ranch, honest man, steady work, good land, she had written to him without telling anyone. She had conducted their entire correspondence in secret, hiding his letters in a hat box under her bed, reading them by lamplight after the rest of the house was asleep. She had meant to come. She had packed a bag. She had arranged the journey. She had been, by her account, 3 days from departure when Victor Blackwood appeared in her father's shop. Nathan had heard of Victor Blackwood. Everyone in this part of Montana had heard of Victor Blackwood, the way you hear of a storm system that has been sitting over someone else's country, present in your awareness as a threat that hasn't quite reached you yet. Blackwood was based in Helena, primarily, but his interests extended. Mining, initially. Then land. Then anything that could be owned and turned into money, including, apparently, people. Blackwood had bought her father's debt. All of it, in a single transaction, the day before he walked into the shop. He arrived the next morning holding the paperwork and smiling in the particular way powerful men smile when they've already decided how a conversation is going to end. He said he had admired Evelyn from across a room at some social function months earlier. He said he was a man who knew what he wanted and knew how to get it. He told her father that the debt would be forgiven completely if Evelyn agreed to become his wife. She refused. Immediately, and without hesitation, she refused. And then Blackwood explained what would happen if she continued to refuse. Oliver found her in the morning. Nathan heard it from the kitchen, a small voice saying, "Who are you?" in the direct way children have, without the social insulation adults learn to wrap around their curiosity. He came to the doorway and watched his son standing in front of the settee in his nightshirt, looking at this woman who had appeared in their house overnight, and felt something shift in his chest in a way that made him briefly uncomfortable. "My name is Evelyn," she said. She'd pushed herself up to sitting, and her hair was loose around her shoulders. The wedding dress exchanged sometime in the night for one of Clara's old house dresses that Walter must have found and left without comment. "What's yours?" "Oliver. Did my father bring you here?" "He did." "Were you cold?" "Very." Oliver considered this. "We have an extra blanket," he said. "It's in the trunk, but Papa said it's for emergencies." "This was a bit of an emergency," Evelyn said. Oliver nodded as though this satisfied him completely, and then asked if she wanted breakfast, because apparently his hospitality instincts outran most other considerations. Nathan watched Evelyn's expression do something complicated, something that moved through amusement and arrived somewhere that looked almost like grief, the way sometimes kindness in unexpected places hits harder than cruelty, and he made himself look away before she caught him watching. The full story came out over the next 2 days, in pieces, the way people tell things they have been holding for a long time. Not in a single flood, but in increments, testing the ground first, seeing how much weight it will bear before they put their full weight on it. What Blackwood had done was systematic. That was the word Nathan kept returning to as the picture assembled itself. Not impulsive, not cruel in the disorganized way of men who simply don't think about consequences. Systematic. Each step followed from the last with the patience of someone who had planned it. When Evelyn refused to marry him, Blackwood made clear what refusing would mean. Her father's debt would come due immediately. The shop would be seized. Her father, who was not young and was not well, would have nothing. The family would lose the house. Every piece of security they had, however thin, would disappear. She asked him to give her time to think. He gave her 48 hours. She spent those 48 hours trying to find another way, writing urgent letters to a cousin in Ohio, trying to calculate whether there was some legal avenue, trying to figure out if there was anyone who could help. She wrote to Nathan, a long letter explaining what was happening and asking him to wait. Blackwood's man intercepted it at the post office. She found out later, much later, that her letters, all of them, the ones she sent after Blackwood's ultimatum, the ones she kept sending in the months after the wedding, believing Nathan had simply stopped responding, the desperate ones she sent in the second year when things were at their worst, had all been intercepted. Some by Blackwood's foreman, some by the man at the post office who had been paid well to hold anything addressed to Montana with her name on it. Nathan's letters to her, the ones he sent in the weeks before the silence started, she had never received at all. She had walked down the aisle believing Nathan was alive somewhere in Montana, probably furious with her, possibly having already moved on. She had said her vows knowing they were built on coercion, knowing the man standing next to her had manufactured every condition that made them possible. She had done it because the alternative was watching her father destroyed and having that on her conscience for the rest of her life. Blackwood had gotten what he wanted. He always did. Life in the Blackwood house, she told Nathan. On the second evening, while Oliver slept and the fire burned down and the wind outside had shifted to that particular howl, that means serious cold moving in, was not what anyone who didn't know Victor Blackwood might have expected. He didn't hit her. She said that plainly, the way you say things that sound like good news but are actually designed to complicate your understanding of something. He didn't hit me, she said. I want to be clear about that because I think sometimes people assume that's the only thing that counts. What he did instead was control. Complete, comprehensive, considered control. He chose her clothes. He managed her social calendar. He decided who she spoke to, for how long, and in what contexts. When they attended functions, and they attended many, because Blackwood was a man who moved in certain circles, and a wife was part of the presentation, she was expected to be pleasant and agreeable and to confirm, by her cheerful presence, that the marriage was exactly what it appeared to be. She was not permitted to send letters without his review. This was presented as a practical arrangement at first. I'll have these sent with my correspondence. It's more efficient. And it took her 3 months to understand that it wasn't practical at all, that it was architectural, that the whole structure of her daily life was designed to ensure that nothing she said or did reached the outside world without his knowledge. She tried to leave twice before the night she finally made it. The first time, 8 months in, she got as far as the train station in Helena before one of Blackwood's men found her and brought her back. Victor had not been angry in any visible way. He'd been disappointed, which was somehow worse. He told her calmly that he understood she was still adjusting, that marriage was difficult, that he was committed to making her happy, and hoped she would give him the opportunity to do so. Then he'd quietly dismissed 2 of the household servants she had trusted. The second time, she didn't even get to the road. Someone had seen her preparing and told him, and she never found out who. After that, she stopped trying to run and started planning instead. She spent 6 months watching the house, learning the patterns of the men he employed, learning which doors were checked and which were assumed, learning what time the man outside her window on the second floor rotated with the man below, and how long the gap was between them. The gap was 4 minutes. She had waited for a night when the gap aligned with the social function Blackwood was attending in town, a function she had been told was too tedious for women, which was Victor's way of saying he wanted to attend without the performance of managing her presence. She waited for him to leave. She waited another hour to be certain. She put on the wedding dress she'd been forced to wear at their ceremony because it was the only formal garment she hadn't worn to tatters, and she'd calculated she would need the full skirt length for the drop from the windowsill. Then she went out the window. She had made it further than she'd expected. She'd made it across the property, across the north field, and almost 4 miles down the mountain road before the cold became serious. Her feet had been a problem from the first minutes, but she hadn't let herself stop to think about them because she'd known that stopping to think was the same as stopping entirely. She'd kept moving because the alternative was to be found by Blackwood's men and brought back, and that was the one thing she had decided, with absolute certainty, she would not survive a third time. Not physically. She wasn't sure she would survive it in any way that mattered. She had been trying to reach the Walker Ranch because it was the only address she had memorized in Montana, because she had read Nathan's return address on his letters so many times that it had become part of her geography, the way childhood streets become part of your geography, present without effort. She hadn't known if he was still there. She hadn't known if he was alive. She hadn't known if, even if he was there and alive, he would be anything other than the man who thought she'd abandoned him and had spent 2 years building a life without her. She had walked toward his address anyway, because what she needed was not rescue, she said. What she needed was somewhere to stand while she figured out the rest. Nathan listened to all of this without speaking much. He asked a few clarifying questions, dates, names, specific locations, the kind of details that helped him build an accurate picture. But mostly he listened. And the thing that surprised him was how much he believed her. He hadn't expected to believe her. He had spent 2 years constructing an explanation for her silence that involved her agency and her choice, and having that explanation dismantled was not a comfortable experience. Some part of him had been prepared to hear her out with patience while maintaining internal reservations. Instead, he found himself believing her while she was still talking, and the discomfort that followed was the discomfort of realizing that his private story about what had happened was wrong, and had been wrong the whole time. There was a man in the county who had written them a wrong story. A man who had looked at two people trying to build something real and had decided their letters were a resource he could exploit, their future's a problem he could solve in his favor. Nathan sat with the fire and thought about that for a long time after Evelyn stopped talking. "You said the letters were intercepted," he finally said. "Yes. All of them. As far as I can tell. I never received anything from you after the first 2 months, and I kept writing for—" She paused. "A long time. Past the point when it made sense. I wrote because it felt like something I was doing for myself, not because I believed they were getting through." "Someone had to be helping him on this end," Nathan said. "The post office here, or—" He stopped. Something had just moved through his chest, a cold thing, not related to the temperature. He thought about Walter Hayes, who had been on this ranch for 6 years, who knew everything about the place, including who Nathan corresponded with and why. Who had been the first person Nathan had spoken to after the silence started, the person who had listened to Nathan's confusion and hurt, and said, with what had seemed like genuine sympathy, "Some women get cold feet, Nathan. It happens. You're better off knowing now." Walter, who had looked at Evelyn in the wagon bed last night with an expression Nathan hadn't been able to read. He sat very still, thinking about this, not yet ready to say it out loud. Because saying it out loud would make it something he would have to deal with, and right now there were enough things he was dealing with. "Get some sleep," he said to Evelyn. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning." She looked at him for a moment. She had the eyes of someone who has learned not to trust reassurances, who has been reassured before in contexts that turned out badly. But she also had the eyes of someone who was very tired. "All right," she said. Nathan added wood to the fire and sat awake in the chair until well past midnight, listening to the house and thinking about everything he thought he'd known and how much of it turned out to have been constructed on a foundation that someone else had laid. Outside, the snow kept falling. Montana did not care about any of this. It just kept piling the cold on, the way it always had, indifferent to what people did to each other underneath it, patient as stone, waiting for spring or something harder, whichever came first. The morning Walter Hayes avoided looking at Evelyn was the morning Nathan started paying attention to what Walter's eyes were doing. It wasn't dramatic. Walter was good at not being dramatic. That was part of what had made him useful for 6 years, the steadiness of him, the way he moved through difficult situations without adding noise to them. But there was a difference between calm and careful, and Nathan had spent enough time around both to know which one he was looking at now. Walter brought in wood for the fire. He made coffee. He fed the horses and came back and reported on the condition of the north fence line the way he always did. He did everything he was supposed to do, and he did not look directly at Evelyn once. Evelyn did not appear to notice. She was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands around a coffee cup, still wearing Clara's old house dress, her feet wrapped in cloth Nathan had cut from a flannel shirt because there was nothing else available in the right weight. Oliver was next to her eating his breakfast with the focused intensity of a 5-year-old who has discovered that the unusual woman staying in his house is willing to listen to him talk about horses for extended periods. "Papa's horse is named George," Oliver told her. "He's not nice." "George isn't nice, or your papa isn't nice?" Oliver gave this genuine consideration. "George, papa is nice sometimes." "High praise," Evelyn said. Nathan watched this exchange from the doorway and felt several things at once that he didn't have a clean name for. He turned and went out to the barn because the alternative was standing in doorways feeling things, which was not particularly useful. Walter followed him. Nathan had been expecting that. They stood in the barn's particular quiet, the animal smell of it, the particular cold that accumulated in spaces that were enclosed but not heated, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Nathan picked up a bridle that needed mending and turned it in his hands. "You know who she is," Nathan said. It wasn't a question. Walter was quiet for a beat too long. "I recognized the name. From the letters." Another beat. Then, "Yes." Nathan set the bridle down on the workbench and looked at his ranch hand. Walter was 53, broad through the shoulders, a man who had worked this kind of land his whole life and had the particular permanent weathering that came with that. He looked, Nathan thought, like a man who had been expecting this conversation and had not been able to figure out how to want it to go. "Tell me what you did," Nathan said. "Nathan, don't start with my name. Tell me what you did." Walter's jaw worked. He looked at the wall, at the horses, at somewhere past Nathan's shoulder. After the third or fourth letter with no answer, when she just stopped, "You remember how you were. You weren't sleeping. You'd made plans. You'd told Oliver there was going to be someone coming. It hit you hard." "I remember." "And then her letters stopped and you didn't know why, and you were—" Walter stopped. "You were in bad shape, Nathan. I'm not saying that to excuse anything. I'm saying it's what I saw." "Keep going." "Two letters came after you'd already given up on her." Walter finally looked at him directly, which took something, Nathan could tell. The man was not a coward, but this was costing him. "I found them in the post first. You were out on the north pasture, and I rode in for supplies and the postmaster had them. And I made a decision I thought I was making for you." The barn was very quiet. "You kept them," Nathan said. "I burned them." Nathan had expected this. He had suspected it from the moment the cold thing moved through his chest the night before. Expecting something and hearing it said out loud were two different experiences, and he took a moment with the gap between them before he responded. "Did you know why she hadn't arrived? Did the letters say?" "The first one said something had happened, that a man named Blackwood that she was being forced into something. I didn't know if it was true. Women who got cold feet sometimes told stories, Nathan. I'd seen it before." "You'd seen it before." "I thought, what did you think, Walter? Tell me exactly what you thought." Walter's shoulders had dropped slightly, the posture of a man who has run out of the angles he prepared. "I thought it was kinder, to let you believe she'd just gone, than to believe she was out there somewhere and had chosen someone else anyway, under duress or not. I thought a clean break was kinder than a story about how some rich man had taken her and there wasn't a damn thing you could do about it. You decided that, on my behalf." "I did." "Without asking me?" "Yes." Nathan picked up the bridle again. He didn't mend it, he just held it. "She spent 2 years in that man's house," he said. 2 years, Walter. She walked out a window in December with no shoes on, her feet." He stopped because he didn't trust his voice to stay level through the rest of that sentence, and he was not going to give his voice permission to do anything else in this conversation. Walter didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would help, and they both knew it. "I want you to pack what's yours," Nathan said. "I want you off this property by tonight." Walter looked at him. Something in his face shifted in a way that was hard to watch. Not argument, exactly, but the particular expression of a man who wants to argue and understands that he has no right to. "It's the middle of winter, Nathan. I know what time of year it is. Where am I supposed to go?" "That's not a problem I can solve for you." Walter stood there another moment. Then he nodded, a single tight motion, and turned toward the back of the barn where his spare gear was stored. Nathan walked out into the cold because he could not stand the barn any longer, and stood in the yard and breathed through his nose until the thing in his chest settled enough to be managed. Oliver appeared in the house doorway. "Papa, is Walter leaving?" "Yes." "Why?" Nathan looked at his son. 5 years old, dark eyes, wearing his coat buttoned wrong because he'd done it himself. "Come here," Nathan said. Oliver came, and Nathan buttoned his coat correctly and said, "Walter and I had a disagreement. Sometimes people have disagreements that mean they can't work together anymore." "Will he come back?" "I don't think so." Oliver took this in with the careful seriousness he brought to things he didn't fully understand but recognized as important. "Is Evelyn going to stay?" he asked. Nathan looked at the house. Through the kitchen window he could see the shape of her, still at the table, hands around her cup, looking out at something he couldn't see from here. "That's up to her," he said. What neither of them knew yet was that Victor Blackwood had been awake since 3 in the morning. The discovery that Evelyn was gone had come at 11 the previous night, when the man Blackwood stationed near the East Hall came to knock on his study door with the careful knock of someone delivering news they'd rather not deliver. Blackwood had listened without expression, which his people knew was never a good sign. Victor Blackwood expressing emotion meant he was performing emotion, which meant it was controlled and probably tactical. Victor Blackwood showing no expression at all meant something else. He sat for a moment after they left. Then he picked up the decanter from his desk and poured himself a measure of brandy, and drank it, and put the glass down, and began to think. He was not a man who panicked. Panic was a response to surprise, and he had spent his life arranging things so that surprises were minimal. What had happened, Evelyn climbing out of a window and running, was not entirely a surprise. He had known for some time that her attempts to comply with their arrangement were becoming strained. He had also known, from experience with other people, that there was a significant difference between strain and action, and most people stayed in strain for much longer than they should because action required a kind of commitment to consequences they couldn't quite make. Evelyn had apparently made it. He sent men after her. Of course he did. He gave instructions for them to move quietly. No need for the whole county to know there'd been a disruption in the Blackwood household, and to bring her back without visible damage, which was his way of saying, "Be careful, but I don't actually care if she's hurt as long as it doesn't show." Then he sat back down and thought about the longer problem. The longer problem was the question of where she'd gone. She had no money. He'd arranged that years ago, slowly, in ways that would look like normal domestic management to anyone who was asked to examine it. She had no contacts in Helena that weren't his contacts first. She had no one in Montana who... He stopped. He had made it his business, early in the marriage, to understand what Evelyn's situation had been before she came to him. He was thorough that way. He knew about the St. Louis family and the failing business and the letters she had been sending to that advertisement. He knew the name of the rancher she'd been corresponding with. He had even found it useful, early on, to have someone watch the post on both ends. It was a relatively simple operation, and Blackwood believed in thoroughness. He sat very still and thought, Walker Ranch, Montana, 2 days' ride. Then he poured a second brandy, though he didn't drink it. He just sat with it, thinking about how this was going to be handled. Victor Blackwood did not like losing what he considered his. Not out of love. He would have been the first to tell you that love had very little to do with anything in his life, including his marriage. He didn't like it for the same reason a man with a very organized desk doesn't like someone moving his papers. Evelyn occupying the position she occupied in his household served specific purposes. Her absence created a specific set of problems, not least of which was the question of what she might tell people and who might listen. He let his men handle the first night. By morning, when they came back empty-handed, he understood that she had either gotten somewhere warmer or she hadn't survived the cold. Either way, someone was going to have to go find out. He wrote 2 letters that morning. One was to his lawyer, a man named Creel, who was based in Billings and who had managed various delicate situations for Blackwood over the years. The other was to the county sheriff, whom Blackwood had found it useful to maintain a cordial relationship with. Then he began to think about Nathan Walker and what Nathan Walker would do with a woman who arrived at his door in a wedding dress. The answer that came to him was not comforting. Evelyn was better by the 3rd day. Her feet still hurt. They would hurt for weeks, she understood, the kind of deep hurt that settles into tissue after serious cold damage, the kind that reminded you it was there every time you stood up. But she could walk, carefully, and the bruising was fading, and the sleep she'd gotten in the 2 days since Nathan brought her in was the first sleep she'd had in 2 years that wasn't contaminated by the particular anxious alertness of living in a house where you were never quite sure what the next thing was going to be. She spent time with Oliver, who was uncomplicated in the way 5-year-olds are uncomplicated. He wanted to show her things and tell her things and ask her questions, and her answers were either interesting or they weren't, and if they weren't, he moved on without offense. She spent time in the kitchen, which she used partly because it needed doing, and partly because having something physical to do with her hands had always been the best way she knew to keep her thoughts in a manageable arrangement. She was aware of the situation with Walter without Nathan having told her explicitly. She'd seen the way Nathan came back from the barn that morning, and she'd seen Walter's truck, the old wagon, pulled around to the side of the house, and she'd heard the particular quality of silence that follows a difficult conversation. By evening, Walter was gone, and Nathan didn't mention him, and Evelyn didn't ask because she understood there were some things a person needed to be ready to talk about, and some things they didn't. What she did ask, on the 3rd evening, when Oliver was asleep, and the house was quiet in the way houses get, when the wind drops and there's just the fire, was, "What are you going to do?" Nathan looked up from the harness he was repairing. The man repaired things constantly, she'd noticed, not obsessively, but in the way of someone who understood that objects required maintenance and that letting things go was more expensive than tending to them. About what, specifically? About Blackwood coming. He looked at her for a moment. "You think he'll come?" "I know he'll come," Evelyn said. "I know the way he thinks. He's not going to let me walk away, Nathan. Not because he wants me. He doesn't want me, not in any real sense. He wants... She tried to find the right word. He wants the arrangement. He wants me in the position I was in because that position serves things for him. It's not personal. That's somehow worse, Nathan said. Yes, she agreed. It is. He set the harness down. He had a way of giving someone his full attention when he decided that was different from how most men did it. He didn't lean in or perform attentiveness. He just went still, and the stillness was the attention. He'll bring lawyers, Nathan said, and probably men with him. He's not going to arrive quietly. No, he never does anything quietly. He'll have a story prepared. He's good at stories. She looked at the fire. He'll say I'm unstable. He'll say the marriage was legitimate and I left without cause and he's concerned for my well-being. He'll say it so many times and with such consistent detail that it will start to sound like the only version. But we have your version. Yes. And I'm a woman who arrived at your house in a torn dress with no shoes on. My version can be made to look like any number of things by a man with money and lawyers and a reputation in this county. Nathan was quiet for a moment. My version can be made to look like things too, he said, a lonely widower who found himself a woman under convenient circumstances. I know, Evelyn said. I've thought about that. And? She looked at him directly. This was something she'd had to relearn in the past 3 days, looking at people directly, without calculating what they were likely to do with whatever they saw in her face. She was still recalibrating it, still occasionally catching herself measuring exits and contingencies before she could stop. And I think the truth is harder to destroy than a good story if you have evidence for it. I wrote a lot of letters, Nathan. He intercepted them, but intercepting something isn't the same as destroying the fact that it was written and sent. If I can get to the postmaster and Helena, if I can find any of the servants who saw things. There are people who know what Victor's house looked like from the inside. People he didn't think to worry about because he never thought I'd get out. Nathan's expression did something that wasn't quite a smile but was in the vicinity of one. You've been planning this a while. I've been planning various versions of this for about a year, she said. What I didn't plan for was... She gestured at the room around her, a gesture that meant the house, the fire, the harness on the table, Oliver asleep in the back. I didn't plan for anywhere to land. The fire popped. Nathan picked up the harness again, not to work on it, just to have something in his hands. You can stay here, he said. It came out more direct than he'd probably meant it to. She could hear the slight roughness of someone saying a thing they'd been deciding about. For as long as you need, whatever comes next, you're not facing it from the road. Evelyn looked at him. She had been in enough situations with enough men to have built a reasonably accurate set of instincts about what things cost people to say and what they expected in return for saying them. What she read in Nathan Walker's face was neither the expectation of gratitude nor the expectation of anything. He'd said it the way you say a thing because it's the right thing, and you've made your peace with the consequences. Thank you, she said, and meant it in the way you mean something when words feel thin for the purpose, but there's nothing better available. The letter from Victor Blackwood arrived on a Tuesday. It came addressed to Nathan Walker, written in the very formal hand of a man who had a secretary and used him. Nathan read it standing at the kitchen table because he hadn't thought to sit down first, and then he read it again, sitting down, and then he set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. It was polite. That was the thing about Victor Blackwood that Evelyn had tried to explain, and that Nathan now understood more concretely. The man was always, in writing, impeccably polite. The letter expressed Blackwood's concern for his wife's well-being following what he described as an episode of distress. It noted that Evelyn had a history of periods of difficulty, which Victor framed with genuine-seeming compassion, as though he were a devoted husband worried about a wife who struggled with her nerves. It stated that if Nathan Walker was indeed harboring Mrs. Blackwood, it would be in everyone's best interest for her to be returned to the care of her family, and that Mr. Blackwood was prepared to be understanding about the circumstances given that Mr. Walker had presumably acted in good faith. The last paragraph mentioned a lawyer named Creel and used the word legal 3 times. Nathan handed the letter to Evelyn without comment. She read it. Her expression went through several things that she didn't bother to conceal, and Nathan watched the progression because he thought it was important to see how she actually responded to things, rather than building an impression of her based on how she'd explained things. What he saw was recognition first. This is what she had predicted. Then something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. The physical response of someone who has been in the reach of something dangerous for a long time and can feel it reaching again. Then below that, something harder. Something that wasn't fear at all. She set the letter down. "He's calling me unstable," she said. "Yes. He's setting up the argument that anything I say about the marriage can be attributed to mental fragility rather than fact. That's what it looks like to me. He's done this to people before," she said. It wasn't a question. This exact thing, the letter, the lawyer, the framing, he's practiced at this. Nathan didn't say anything. He'd been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to be the one to say it first. Evelyn folded the letter along its original creases. "We need to talk to someone in Billings," she said. "Someone who knows property law and marriage law and isn't already in Blackwood's pocket. Do you know anyone like that?" "I know a man," Nathan said. "His name is Aldrich Penn. He handled some land business for me 2 years ago. I trust him about as much as I trust anyone in that line of work, which is to say cautiously but meaningfully. Can you get to him this week?" "I'd need to leave Oliver with someone." Evelyn looked at him. "I can watch Oliver." Nathan opened his mouth and closed it. He looked at her. She understood what was moving through his head. He was weighing the practicality against the strangeness of leaving his son with a woman he had known for 3 days, even a woman he was choosing to believe, and she appreciated that he was doing the math honestly rather than just accepting or refusing on instinct. "He likes you," Nathan finally said, which was not nothing, coming from a man like Nathan Walker. "I know," she said. "I like him too. He's a straightforward person. There's not much of that around." Nathan almost said something that would have been personal, and she could see him pull back from it. "I'll ride out the day after tomorrow," he said instead. "Weather permitting." She nodded. The letter sat between them on the table, Victor Blackwood's careful handwriting facing up, and both of them looked at it for a moment with the particular feeling of people who understand they have just crossed into a situation they cannot uncross. "I was gone for 3 days. Evelyn managed the ranch with Oliver and the horses and the particular series of tasks that turn out to be necessary when you look directly at a working property for the first time. She'd grown up in a city and knew nothing about ranching, but she knew how to work, which turned out to be a significant portion of what was required. She fed animals. She kept the fire. She cooked in the earnest, imperfect way of someone who had learned cooking from necessity rather than instruction. Oliver ate whatever she made without complaint, which she suspected said more about his general constitution than about the food. The cold was something she was still recalibrating. She had grown up with Missouri winters, which were serious but not this. Montana cold in December was a different category. A cold that had weight and intention, that pushed against the walls of the house and found its way in through gaps you hadn't known were there. She understood in a physical way, sleeping in this house, that survival out here was not abstract. It was literal. The warmth of a good fire in December wasn't a comfort, it was a fact of life. She thought about Nathan constantly, not with the particular color of what she'd felt reading his letters 2 years ago. That was a different thing, built out of words on paper and the image a person constructs of someone they haven't met. What she thought about now was more specific. The way he'd caught her in the road without knowing who she was, and gotten her warm before he asked any questions. The way he'd fired Walter without performing the anger about it, just told him to go and meant it. The way he'd read Blackwood's letter standing up at the table and then sat down to read it again, which told her something about how he processed things. That he gave himself the information twice before deciding what to do with it. She thought about what he had not said in any of their conversations. He had not told her that everything was going to be fine. He had not promised outcomes he couldn't control. He told her she could stay here, and he'd told her he'd go to Billings, and he'd set about doing those things. And the simplicity of that, the lack of performance in it, was something she kept returning to without entirely meaning to. She did not trust it yet. She was honest with herself about that. She had been in a house for 2 years with a man who was also capable of being reliable seeming, capable of speaking in ways that sounded reasonable and grounded until you understood what that reasonableness was in service of. She did not believe Nathan Walker was like Victor Blackwood in any fundamental way, but she also understood that she'd been made wrong about a person before, And the scar tissue from that had not stopped being scar tissue just because she was somewhere different. Oliver asked her on the second day if she was going to live here. I don't know yet, she told him honestly. Do you want to? She looked at him across the kitchen table. He had his father's directness in him, the quality of asking what he actually wanted to know rather than building toward it. I think that's a more complicated question than it looks, she said. Oliver thought about this. I want you to, he said simply. Then he went back to his breakfast. Evelyn sat with that for a while. It was not a small thing, the desire of a 5-year-old who had decided she was welcome. She knew it was not a small thing, even as she was careful not to let it weigh more than it should in her calculation. Nathan came back on the third evening with the particular bearing of a man who has spent 3 days thinking hard about something and arrived somewhere. He came in, let Oliver tell him everything that had happened in his absence in the enthusiastic manner of a child, recounting 3 days of events in approximately 45 seconds, acknowledged all of it with appropriate gravity, and then sat down at the table with Evelyn. Penn thinks we can fight it, he said. He says the law on forced marriage is not straightforward, and Blackwood's people are good, but there are angles. He wants to know about the letters, whether there's any record on either end, whether there are witnesses in Helena. There are people who worked in that house, Evelyn said. A woman named Agnes. She was the kitchen housekeeper for the first year. She left under circumstances that weren't, I don't know her full name, but I remember her. And the man at the post office in Helena, if he can be reached in a way that makes talking to us worth more to him than not talking to us. Penn has done this kind of work before, Nathan said. He knows how to find people who know things. Evelyn nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, He'll spend money on this, Nathan. Victor will spend money. More than you have. Probably, Nathan said. You'd be mortgaging your ranch. I've looked at the books. She stopped, because she'd had to look at the books to manage the household while he was gone, and she wasn't sure if that had overstepped something. I'm sorry, I needed the numbers to… You did the right thing, he said without hesitation. Yes, I'd be mortgaging the ranch. I know that. She looked at him. Why? He met her eyes. And there it was again. That stillness, that quality of direct attention that she was still getting used to. Because you walked 4 miles in December with no shoes on, he said, and the man you were walking away from thinks that constitutes a problem he owns. That's not something I can stand next to and do nothing about. It was not a declaration. It was not romantic in any performed sense. It was just a statement of position, the way he did things, clear, grounded, without embellishment. Evelyn looked at the table. She looked at the fire. She thought about 2 years of letters that never arrived, and a photograph in a drawer somewhere in this house, and a man who had written to a woman he'd never met and meant what he said. All right, she said, then let's figure out how to win. Outside, the December wind came off the mountains with its particular weight, pressing against the walls of the Walker Ranch, the way the cold always pressed, hard and steady, and not interested in what the people inside had decided. But the walls held. For now, they held. Walter's things were gone from the bunkhouse by the time Nathan got back from the barn that first morning, but the absence of them took longer to settle into the property than the absence of the man himself. That was the strange thing about someone who had been somewhere for 6 years. The space they occupied didn't empty cleanly. It left traces. A coffee cup on the wrong shelf because Walter had always put it there. A particular way the barn tools were hung that had been Walter's system and not Nathan's. The habit Nathan had of turning to say something and finding no one to say it to. Oliver noticed too, in the quiet way children notice things that adults think are too subtle for them. He didn't ask about Walter again after that first morning. He just watched his father with the careful attention of someone taking inventory of what had changed. What had changed was considerable. The ranch ran on 2 people when it was built for 3, and that was felt in the first week in specific physical ways. The fence work that got pushed back. The hour later Nathan came in at night, the particular fatigue that settled into his shoulders by Thursday that he didn't bother trying to hide because there was no one to hide it from. Evelyn watched the mathematics of it without commenting, which was its own kind of comment. She had started taking on the things she could take on without being asked, the cooking, the house management, the keeping of Oliver's time in some reasonable structure, and the things she couldn't do yet because she didn't know enough. She paid close enough attention to that she was learning. She was not a woman who sat still well. Nathan had figured that out by day 4. She was also not a woman who announced what she was doing or asked for permission to do it. She just found the next thing that needed doing and did it, and if she did it wrong, she adjusted without drama. Nathan found this easier to be around than he'd expected. He'd worried, in the abstract way you worry about arrangements before they exist, about how it would feel to have someone else in the space Clara had occupied. What he discovered was that Evelyn didn't occupy that space at all. She occupied her own space, and the two things were simply not the same, and the clarity of that distinction made it easier rather than harder. He didn't say this to anyone. There was no one to say it to. Penn wrote back the second week with specific instructions. He needed a written account from Evelyn, detailed, dated where possible, describing the coercion, the intercepted letters, the conditions of the marriage, and the circumstances of her departure. He needed Nathan to document everything on his end, the dates of his correspondence with Evelyn, the date the letters stopped, anything he could recall about the timeline. He needed whatever Nathan could tell him about Walter Hayes and what Walter had done with the 2 letters, because that detail, someone on the ground intercepting correspondence, was a thread worth pulling. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and wrote her account over the course of 2 evenings. Nathan saw it happening and left her to it, which she appreciated more than she would have known how to say. Writing it was not easy, not because she had trouble with the facts. The facts were very clear in her memory, preserved in the way that things you survive tend to be preserved, in detail you'd rather not have, but because the act of laying them out sequentially, in plain language, on paper, made them real in a different way than carrying them around had. What she'd carried around was something she lived with. What she put on paper was something other people were going to read and judge and form opinions about. And she'd spent 2 years in a house where her version of events was systematically replaced with Victor's version, and the instinct to manage what she put in writing ran deeper than she'd realized until she was sitting there doing it. She wrote it anyway, all of it, the debt and the ultimatum and the 48 hours, the intercepted letters, the wedding she'd walked through like a woman walking to a sentencing. The 2 years of trying to reach Nathan and getting nothing back, not understanding for months that the nothing was not silence from him, but theft by someone else. The first escape attempt and the quiet menace of the consequences. The second attempt and the informant she never identified. The 6 months of watching patterns and timing gaps and saving the window as a last resort. When she finished, she read it back once and didn't change anything. The facts were the facts. Nathan drove to Billings to deliver both documents to Penn and was back by nightfall. He didn't elaborate much on the conversation. Penn was working, Nathan said. Penn had people he trusted in Helena who were already looking for Agnes, the former kitchen housekeeper. The postmaster question was more complicated because the man had technically been paid to perform a service, and what that service counted as legally was something Penn was still working through. He thinks the letters are the key, Nathan told her, proving that communication was deliberately obstructed. That's what Blackwood's entire position depends on, the idea that you made your choices freely. If we can show that your choices were made inside a wall someone built around you, that changes the structure of the argument. Victor will say the letters were never sent, Evelyn said. He'll say I'm constructing a narrative. Probably. But Penn says there's a difference between saying it and being able to prove it with the weight Blackwood has on the other side. Money changes what people can say. Evidence changes what they can sustain. She thought about this. Agnes would testify, she said, if she felt safe enough to. She saw things in that house that she didn't say anything about because she needed the work, and she left because she couldn't stay anymore. But she's not a coward. She's just a woman who is trying to survive, same as everyone else. Then we find her, Nathan said. They were sitting at the table again. They did a great deal of talking at this table, she'd noticed, the way important conversations seemed to want a horizontal surface between people, somewhere to put their hands. And Oliver was in bed, and the fire was low, and the wind outside had the particular sustained quality of a system settling in for a long stay. Nathan, she said, not the way you say someone's name to get their attention, the way you say it when you want to make sure what follows is received as direct. He looked at her. I want you to understand what you're getting into, she said, not the legal part. You understand the legal part. I mean, Victor is the kind of man who doesn't stop at the law. He's used the law as a tool his whole life, and he knows how to use it, but he also knows when to go around it. If this goes the way we think it might go, he will try to damage you in ways that have nothing to do with courts. He'll talk to people about the ranch, about your financial situation. He'll find whatever is inconvenient about your past and put it somewhere useful. I don't have much that's inconvenient, Nathan said. Everyone has something, and if there isn't something, he'll make something. He's good at making things. She held his eyes. I'm not saying this to frighten you off. I'm saying it because you deserve to know what standing next to me right now actually costs. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind shifted pitch by a half step, the particular sound it made when it came around the northeast corner of the house. I appreciate that, he said, but I made my decision when I mortgaged the place. I'm not interested in revising it based on what Blackwood might try to do. Why not? She asked. She meant it as a genuine question, not a challenge. He looked at her for long enough that she wondered if she'd overstepped something. Then he said, Because I read your letters for 6 months, and I'm not a man who reads someone's letters for 6 months and then decides they're not worth the trouble when the trouble arrives. That's not how I want to be. Evelyn looked at him. She said, You're describing who you want to be, not who you are. They're the same, he said simply. Not defensively, just as a fact. She believed him. That was the part that unsettled her. She believed him, and she had not believed anyone without reservation for 2 years, and the experience of believing someone again was not as comfortable as she would have expected. It was like feeling a limb after it's been asleep for a long time. The return of feeling is not pleasant. It's sharp and strange, and you're very aware of it in a way you aren't when everything is numb. She looked back at the fire. All right, she said. Then we should talk about what we actually know and what we're still missing, because I think there's something I haven't told Penn yet that might matter. What she hadn't told Penn yet was about the ledger. Blackwood kept meticulous financial records. This was not unusual for a man of his position. Meticulous financial records were part of what made a man of his position legible to other men of his position. But what made Victor's records unusual was that they included, mixed in among the normal business accounting, notations that were not about business. She'd found this by accident in the first year. She'd been looking for paper to write a letter and had gone into the study where the writing materials were kept. And she'd pulled open the wrong drawer, and the ledger she found there wasn't the business ledger she'd expected. It had names in it. Next to the names were numbers and dates. Some of the names she recognized. The postmaster in Helena was there, a man whose name she'd seen on county commission documents, a sheriff in a county adjacent to Blackwood's primary holdings. The numbers next to each name were consistent across multiple entries over time, not payments for goods or services, no description attached, just names and numbers and dates going back several years. She had understood immediately what she was looking at. She had also understood immediately that she could not take the ledger. If it disappeared, Victor would know someone had taken it, and the only candidate was her. And so she had done something that she still wasn't sure had been smart or desperate. She had memorized what she could. She'd stood in the study for as long as she dared and committed names and numbers to memory, rehearsing them under her breath until she was certain she had them. And then she'd put the ledger back in the drawer exactly as she'd found it and left and never went back. She told Nathan all of this at the kitchen table on a December night with the fire burning low, and she recited the names in the order she remembered them. And when she was done, Nathan sat very still for a moment. The county sheriff, he said. Not a question. He was looking at something past her. A different county, she said, but close. That's why he's not worried about legal exposure, Nathan said slowly. He's not worried because he's built an arrangement where the people who would be the problem are already part of his solution. Yes. She'd had 2 years to think about this. It's not that he's above the law, it's that he's changed the shape of the law in the places where he operates. Nathan looked at her. Penn needs to know about the ledger. Yes. But the ledger itself, we can't prove it. I saw it. I read it. I have no documentation, no copy, only what I was able to hold in my head. Your testimony about what you saw is evidence. Victor will say I invented it. He's very good at making the alternative sound reasonable. But Penn needs to know, Nathan repeated, because if he's going to build an argument, he needs to know what he's building it against. The whole picture. Evelyn nodded. She had been carrying the ledger information for 2 years like a stone in a pocket, heavy, specific, with no one to hand it to. The relief of having said it out loud was larger than she'd expected. There's something else, she said. Agnes, when she left the house, she left quickly. Victor gave her 24 hours to collect her things. She was frightened. She would have taken something with her if she'd had a reason to, something that could prove what she'd seen. But I don't know if she had the presence of mind for it, or the access. We find Agnes first, Nathan said. Then we figure out what she has. Penn's people are looking. I know, I want to know sooner. He was already thinking about logistics. She could see it in his face, the way it had moved past the conversation into the next problem, the problem after that. He was, she had come to understand, a man who processed things by planning, the same way she processed things by writing. Different tools for the same need, to do something about a thing so it became manageable. The wind pressed against the house. The fire had burned down far enough that the room was cooling, and Nathan got up to add wood, and Evelyn watched him do it. The practical, economical way he moved, no wasted motion, the ease of someone who had lived in the same space for long enough that its requirements were as natural as breathing. She had lived in Victor's house for 2 years and never once felt she knew its requirements. Its requirements shifted according to what Victor needed them to be on any given day. There was no ease possible in that kind of space. You couldn't find the rhythm of something that didn't have one. I'll write to Penn tonight, Nathan said, coming back to the table. All right. He sat down. He looked at the letter he'd been drafting before she'd started talking about the ledger and picked up the pen, and then he stopped. Set the pen down. Can I ask you something? She waited. When you were planning to leave, he said, the 6 months of watching and waiting, did you think about what you were going to do if this didn't work? If I wasn't here, or if I didn't? Yes, she said. What was the plan? She considered the question. It was not a comfortable question. There wasn't one, she said honestly. There was a next step. Get out, get away, get to the road, get warm. After that, I was going to figure it out from wherever I landed. I've learned not to make plans past the immediate problem. Plans that far out assume conditions that can change. Nathan looked at her. That's a hard way to live. It's the way I lived. I'm not recommending it. A small silence. Outside, something in the barn shifted. Probably George, who was unreliable in his sleep the way he was unreliable in most things. Oliver's voice sometimes drifted through the wall when he talked in his sleep, little fragments of his days that his brain was filing away, and she'd started listening for it as a gauge of the night, the way you learn to listen for sounds that tell you what the weather is doing. You said once that you didn't plan for anywhere to land, Nathan said carefully. He was looking at the table, at the letter, not at her. That you planned for the getting out, but not the after. Yes. Is this working? He asked. The landing. Evelyn looked at his profile. The firelight made the planes of his face simpler than they were in daylight. He was a man who asked things carefully, she'd noticed. He thought about the shape of a question before he asked it, but when he asked it, he asked directly, without the social decoration that was meant to soften the risk of the answer. I think it might be, she said. Slowly, carefully. Because it was the honest answer, and because honesty, she was relearning, was something you had to choose to practice if you wanted to keep the ability. It's early. Yes, he agreed, and there's a great deal still in the way. There is. But she stopped, looked at the fire. Yes, I think it might be. Nathan picked up his pen and went back to the letter. The scratch of it on paper was the only sound for a few minutes, and Evelyn stayed at the table while he wrote, not doing anything in particular, just occupying the same space, which was sometimes enough. Victor Blackwood's second letter arrived 2 days later. This one was addressed to both of them. Victor Blackwood's second letter had been addressed to both of them, which was itself a message. It was his way of saying he knew exactly where Evelyn was and exactly what the arrangement looked like. And he wanted them both to understand that he had been watching and that watching was something he was patient about. The letter was longer than the first. Still polite. Victor was always polite in writing. That was the particular discipline of the man, the way he kept his real temperature below the surface of his language. But the politeness in this one had a different texture. The first letter had been an offer of reasonable resolution. This one was a notification. It informed Nathan Walker that Victor Blackwood's legal representatives would be appearing before the district court in Billings in 3 weeks to file a formal petition for the return of Mrs. Blackwood to the custody of her husband, on the grounds of mental instability and the husband's right of protection over a wife who had demonstrated she was not capable of making sound decisions in her own interest. The phrase custody of her husband sat on the page, and neither Nathan nor Evelyn said anything about it for a full minute. Then Evelyn said, 3 weeks. Penn needs to know today, Nathan said. He was already reaching for his coat. Penn received the letter by courier that same afternoon and sent a reply by the next morning that was 3 pages long and written in the rapid, compressed hand of a man who thought faster than most people and had learned to put it on paper before it outran him. The reply told them several things. First, that the petition was aggressive but not unusual for a man of Blackwood's resources. It was a move designed to establish legal precedent before they had time to build a counter-argument, a way of forcing them into a reactive position rather than letting them construct their own case on their own timeline. Second, that 3 weeks was not enough time to do this correctly, and Penn was going to file for a delay on procedural grounds, which he believed he could get, though he said believed with the careful qualification of a man who had been in courts long enough to know that what should happen and what did happen maintained only an occasional relationship. Third, and most importantly, Agnes had been found. She was in Missoula. She had been working in a boarding house, taking in laundry and doing kitchen work, the kind of employment that absorbs women who need to disappear into the economy without leaving much of a trail. Penn's man had found her through a network of domestic workers that Penn had spent years cultivating for exactly this kind of work, and she had listened to what Penn's man said and had not thrown him out, which Penn characterized as a promising beginning. He wanted Nathan and Evelyn to come to Billings. They made arrangements quickly and with the particular efficiency of people who have already thought through most of the contingencies. Oliver went to the Hendersons, a family 4 miles east with 2 children near his age. Nathan had done them favors over the years, the accumulative currency of frontier neighbors, and Mrs. Henderson received Oliver without requiring an explanation, which was the kind of woman she was. The horses Nathan left with enough feed for 5 days and a note for a neighboring rancher to check on them if the trip ran long. Evelyn packed what she had, which was not much. She was still wearing things that had been Clara's, modified by her own hand to fit because she was narrower in the shoulder and longer in the leg. She had sewn in the evenings, practical alterations done with the plain needle and thread competence of a woman who had learned that everything you needed to be able to do, you should learn to do yourself. Nathan had noticed the alterations without commenting on them. He'd noticed a lot of things about her without commenting, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he was. A man who watched carefully and reserved his commentary for the things that actually needed saying. They left before first light on a Wednesday, the wagon loaded with the documents Penn had requested and the written account Evelyn had spent 2 evenings on, and the careful notes Nathan had made about the timeline of their correspondence. The road to Billings in December was not comfortable. It was cold in the active way, the kind of cold that worked at the edges of your coat and found the gap at your collar and settled in for the duration. Evelyn had one of Clara's heavy wool coats and her hands in her lap, and she watched the country go past and thought about what the next week was going to require of her. Nathan drove and didn't push conversation, which she appreciated. They had gotten reasonably good at being in the same space without filling it with noise, a thing that had happened gradually and that she thought about occasionally with something that wasn't quite surprise but was in the neighborhood of it. The recognition of an ease you didn't know was possible until you were already inside it. "Are you frightened?" he asked, about an hour out. "Yes," she said. No hesitation. She'd stopped hedging her honest answers to him around the second week. "Of the court specifically, or of Victor being in the same room," she said. "Of seeing his face and having to speak clearly while I'm looking at it. The court I can manage. Courts are about evidence and argument, and I have those things and I trust Penn to use them well. Victor in the room is different. He has a way of..." She looked for the right description. "He manages rooms. He comes into a space and the space reorganizes around him. Not because he demands it, because he's practiced at it." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "So were you, though," he said. "You spent 6 months watching a house and learning its timing without him knowing. You practiced too. It was just different practice." She looked at him. He was watching the road. "That's not nothing," he said. She turned back to the road herself. The country was gray and flat this far east, the mountains behind them and the long plains spreading out, and the sky was the particular low white of December cloud cover that meant cold with intention. No, she agreed. I suppose it isn't. Penn's office was on the second floor of a building on Montana Avenue, up a set of stairs that groaned in a way that seemed structural rather than cosmetic. Penn himself was a short man of about 50, with the compact, economical build of someone who had never had the patience for anything superfluous, including his own appearance. He shook Evelyn's hand first, which Nathan noticed and Penn did deliberately. It was not an accident, the order of the handshake. It was a statement about whose case this was. He laid everything out on the table in his office and went through it methodically. The timeline of the correspondence, the date Evelyn had been intercepted before reaching the train, the two subsequent attempts to leave and the consequences of each, the intercepted letters on both ends. Walter Hayes, whose role Penn had already begun documenting from Nathan's written account. Hayes is important, Penn said. He's the piece that connects this end to the other. If we can establish that Blackwood had someone watching Nathan's mail, and the fact that Hayes intercepted those two letters suggests he did, then we have the shape of a coordinated operation. Not just a woman who chose to marry someone else, a deliberate, sustained effort to isolate her and eliminate her alternatives. Can Hayes testify to that? Evelyn asked. Will he? Penn looked at her. That's a good question, and the honest answer is I don't know yet. I've sent someone to find him. A man who knows he's been found out sometimes cooperates if he believes cooperation is better for him than the alternative. We'll see what he decides. Victor will try to buy him, Evelyn said. He's done it before. He'll offer Walter more than testifying against him seems worth. Possibly. But there's a version of this where Hayes decides that the distance between what he did and what Blackwood did is significant enough that he wants it on record. He kept 2 letters and burned them. Blackwood built a 2-year prison. Those are different things, and a man who feels the difference might be willing to say so. Nathan had been listening without speaking, which Penn had observed and seemed to have drawn the right conclusions about. He turned to Nathan, now. Your position is important in a way that isn't always obvious, he said. You're not just a witness. You're the man who was defrauded on the other end. Blackwood didn't just trap her. He deliberately destroyed a legitimate agreement between 2 willing parties. That's a different charge with different implications. What kind of implications? Nathan asked. The kind that involve financial damages, potentially. The kind that extend the argument beyond the marriage question into something Blackwood has more to lose by. Penn picked up one of the documents from the table and held it. He's positioned this as a domestic dispute, a husband reclaiming a wife who had a breakdown and fled. The law in domestic disputes favors money and social position. But the moment we make this about fraud, about deliberate interference with a legal arrangement, the terrain changes. He's not a husband pursuing a wife anymore. He's a businessman who committed fraud and then constructed a forced marriage on top of it. Evelyn looked at Penn. He'll adjust the argument when he sees what we're doing. Of course he will. He's not stupid. Penn set the document down. Neither are we. They met Agnes the next morning. Penn's man had brought her from Missoula on the overnight coach, and she arrived at Penn's office looking like a woman who had spent a night on a cold coach after a week of being located by a stranger and having the recent past she'd been trying to leave behind come looking for her. She was somewhere in her 50s, broad through the face, with the red hands of someone who had been doing hard physical work for a long time. And when she saw Evelyn, she stopped in the doorway and stood there for a moment. Evelyn stood up. What passed between them in that second was not sentiment exactly. It was recognition. The particular recognition of 2 people who have been inside the same house and know things about it that they never wanted to know, and who have not spoken those things aloud to anyone, and who find themselves unexpectedly in the same room with someone who would understand if they did. Agnes, Evelyn said. Mrs. Agnes stopped. Miss Whitmore. Either is fine, Evelyn said. Please sit down. Agnes sat. Penn poured coffee. Nathan observed from the chair in the corner where he had positioned himself by instinct as the least important person in this particular room for these particular purposes. Penn had the patience to let them find the shape of the conversation before he started directing it, which was another thing Nathan had come to respect about the man. He waited while Evelyn and Agnes moved through the careful initial exchange of 2 people reestablishing something, where Agnes was now, how she'd managed, the boarding house in Missoula, and the work there. Agnes asked about Oliver, whom she had apparently met once when Nathan had come to Helena on business, and Evelyn had, Nathan hadn't known this until now. Arranged briefly for Oliver to be brought to the house during a visit she'd been permitted to make with a charitable women's organization. A small act of theft, that visit. Taking a piece of something real in a house full of manufactured scenes. Then Penn asked Agnes what she had taken with her when she left the Blackwood house. Agnes looked at her coffee cup. Then she looked at Evelyn. Then she reached into the bag she'd carried in and set on the table and pulled out something that was not large, a folded piece of paper, and underneath it, a small bound notebook, and underneath that, 3 envelopes still sealed, addressed in a handwriting that Nathan recognized because he'd been reading it for the past month. Evelyn's handwriting, on envelopes addressed to Nathan Walker, postmarked and never sent. The room was very quiet. "I took them from the post room," Agnes said. "I didn't know what I was going to do with them. I knew what they were, and I knew what would happen to them if I left them, and I thought—" She stopped. "I thought someone should have them who wasn't him." Evelyn looked at the envelopes for a long moment. She did not reach for them immediately. She looked at them the way you look at something that was yours that you had stopped expecting to see again. Penn was already leaning forward. "Agnes, are you willing to sign a statement about where you found these and when?" "Yes," Agnes said, without hesitation, which told Nathan that she had been expecting this question and had made her decision before she arrived. "And the notebook," Penn said. "Can you tell me what's in it?" Agnes looked at it on the table. "I kept notes," she said. "I know that sounds—" She pressed her lips together. "I kept notes because I had worked in enough houses to know that things happen in houses and the people inside them don't always get to say what happened. I wrote down what I saw, dates, when I could, what was said, what was done." She looked at Evelyn. "I wrote down about the time he locked the study for 3 days after she tried to leave the second time. I wrote down the conversation I heard between him and his foreman about the woman at the post in Helena. I wrote it down because—" She stopped again. "I don't know exactly why. I suppose I thought it might matter to someone eventually." "It matters," Penn said quietly. "It matters considerably." They spent 3 days in Billings. Long days, working days, the kind where you sit in a room with documents and a man who is building an argument and you go over everything 3 times until the argument is sound, not just in its best light, but in every light, including the worst one. Penn was thorough to the point that Nathan occasionally felt the thoroughness as a physical weight, the accumulated density of every possible challenge Blackwood's lawyers might raise and the response to each. Evelyn was better at this than Nathan. She had the particular mental endurance of someone who had been required to maintain composure in difficult circumstances for an extended period. She could sit with a hard question and work it without letting the working of it change her face or her voice. And Penn used that, asked her things in the most uncomfortable possible framings, because he needed to know what Blackwood's lawyers were going to find if they pushed, and he needed her ready. She held up. She held up in the way of someone who is not made of iron, but who has decided that breaking is not available as an option today. And Nathan watched it and thought, this is who she is under pressure, and filed it somewhere important. What Nathan contributed was different. He had the dated letters. His copies of the letters he'd written to Evelyn, kept in the methodical way of a man who kept everything because you never knew what you'd need. He had the record of the correspondence from his end, which established the timeline. He had the account of finding Evelyn on the road, which he wrote at Penn's direction in plain language without embellishment, describing what he'd found and when and in what condition, because those physical details, the torn dress, the bare feet, the bruising, the state of her when she'd arrived, were evidence of something, and Penn wanted them on paper where they couldn't be softened after the fact. On the second evening, Penn came back from a meeting he'd had with someone Nathan didn't know, and sat down with the particular expression of a man who has learned something significant and is deciding how to present it. "I have news about the ledger," he said. Evelyn sat up slightly. "I can't say where this came from," Penn said, "and it's not evidence we can use directly, but it confirms what you described, the payments, the names. There is someone in Helena who has had concerns about Blackwood's operations for some time, and who has been keeping their own record of certain things, and who is willing to provide information, though not to appear in court themselves." "Why not in court?" Nathan asked. "Because they work near Blackwood, because appearing in court against him would mean the end of that, and probably worse. Not everyone can afford to take the risk that you two are taking. Penn looked at them levelly. But what they've given me is enough to establish that the ledger is real, that the names in it are real, and that Blackwood's arrangement with the postmaster and Helena is documented somewhere that isn't just your memory. Can we use any of it? Evelyn asked. Indirectly. The value of it is not in court, not directly. The value is in what Blackwood knows about what we know. If his lawyers understand that we are aware of the ledger, that the names are not a secret we've stumbled onto, but something we can trace, it changes his calculation about how far to push this. Penn picked up his coffee. A man who is fighting for the return of his wife is in one kind of fight. A man who is simultaneously worried about what might come out about his relationship with county officials is in a different kind of fight. We're going to make sure he's in both. Nathan looked at Evelyn. She was looking at Penn, and her expression had the particular quality of someone watching a strategy they've been hoping was possible become something that might actually exist. There's a risk in this, Penn said. I want to be clear about it. If we press too hard on the ledger angle and Blackwood feels cornered, he may decide to escalate rather than settle. I've seen men in his position make very bad decisions when they feel the ground moving under them. He'll escalate anyway, Evelyn said. That's what he does. Giving him more room doesn't stop it. It just delays it. Penn looked at her. You know him better than I do. Yes, she said. I do. Then we proceed as I've described, Penn said, and we make sure we're ready for what comes after. What came after arrived sooner than they'd expected. They were still in Billings when Penn received word that Blackwood had not waited for the court date. He had gone, instead, directly to the county commissioners and filed a separate complaint alleging that Nathan Walker was harboring a fugitive wife and requesting that local law enforcement be directed to retrieve her. He had also, Penn's source reported, paid a visit to the editor of the Billings Gazette, and there was going to be a story in Thursday's paper. Penn told them this over breakfast on the third day, and neither of them said anything for a moment. What does the story say? Nathan asked. I don't have the full text. What I have is the outline. It will say that a prominent Helena businessman is searching for his troubled wife, who fled the family home in December and is believed to be in the care of a rancher outside Billings. It will be sympathetic to Blackwood. It will describe Evelyn in ways that are consistent with his instability argument. Penn paused. It will probably mention the torn wedding dress. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, opened them. He's making the story before I can, she said. Yes, which is why we're going to respond today. I have a contact at the Gazette, not the editor, but a reporter who covers courts and who has worked with me before on legal matters. I'm going to give him a different story. Not everything. Not the ledger, not the names, nothing we need for court, but enough. The letters. Agnes. The basic facts of what actually happened. Penn looked at her. It is your decision whether to let your name be used or to keep you anonymous for now. Both have costs. Evelyn was quiet. Nathan watched her work through it. She had the particular stillness she got when she was thinking hard, where everything in her face settled and her eyes went to some middle distance that wasn't really a place. Use my name, she said. If I'm going to fight this, I'm going to fight it in the open. He put me in a house and closed the doors. I'm done with closed doors. Penn nodded. He looked at Nathan. And you? Whatever she needs from me, Nathan said. Penn allowed himself a small expression that was not quite a smile but was in the territory of approval. There's one more thing, he said. He reached into the folder in front of him and pulled out a piece of paper and slid it across to Nathan. I found Walter Hayes. Nathan looked at the paper. It was a summary of what Penn's man had found, and at the bottom was a note about what Walter had said when offered the choice between testifying voluntarily and being compelled to testify. Walter had chosen voluntary. He had said, according to Penn's note, that he'd been thinking about it since the night he was asked to leave. He'd said that there was a difference between a mistake made out of misguided concern and being the kind of man who watched someone get dragged back to a bad situation when he could have said something to stop it. He'd said he wasn't sure yet which one he was, and he wanted the chance to find out. Nathan sat with this for a moment. He burned the letters, Nathan said, not as an accusation, just as a fact that needed to stay a fact. Yes, Penn said, and he'll have to say so, in court, under oath, with all that entails for how it reflects on him. Penn folded his hands on the table. People make terrible decisions out of what they think is love for someone. It doesn't make the decisions less terrible. But in a case where we need to establish a pattern of interference, a witness who says, "I did this and I know it was wrong," is worth more than almost anything else we have. Evelyn was looking at the table. Nathan watched her face carefully, because the Walter question was one he'd been uncertain how she felt about, whether she would want his testimony used, given that Walter's interference was part of what had kept her trapped, indirectly, by keeping Nathan in the dark about her situation. "Use him," she said, without looking up. "But I don't want him to think it means anything more than what it is. He doesn't get to feel like he fixed something by testifying. He helps us, and he lives with the rest of it." "That's fair," Penn said. Autumn. The Gazette story ran Thursday. Penn's response ran Friday. The Friday piece was shorter, but it was factual in the specific way that facts are hard to argue with. It named the letters, it named Agnes, it named the dates, and it quoted Evelyn directly in a way that the editor, to his credit, had not softened. Evelyn had said, in the meeting with Penn's reporter contact, that she had spent 2 years in a house where every door was managed, and every letter was controlled, and every choice she might have made was examined before she was permitted to make it, and that she had walked out a window in December because a woman who is not permitted to use a door will find another way. She had not said Victor Blackwood is a criminal because Penn had told her not to, not yet. She had not said he paid people to intercept my correspondence because Penn had told her to let that come out in court where it would carry more weight. She had said what she had said, and she had said it clearly, and she had put her name on it. In the Walker Ranch, 50 miles away, Oliver was learning to play checkers with Mrs. Henderson and did not know any of this was happening. The horses had been checked on. The north fence, still unrepaired, was holding well enough in the cold that the lack of repair wasn't yet a problem. The ranch existed in the particular suspended state of a place whose owner is away and whose future is somewhere else being decided. The court date was set for the second week of January. Penn had gotten the delay he'd sought, 2 weeks, not the month he'd asked for, but enough. In that 2 weeks they would prepare. They would take Agnes's statement in a form that could be entered as evidence. They would take Walter's statement, and Penn would spend 2 days going through it in the same way he'd gone through Evelyn's, pushing at every angle until it held or broke and could be repaired. On the night before they left Billings to go back to the ranch, Nathan and Evelyn sat in the small dining room of the boarding house where they'd been staying and ate a meal that was adequate but not more, and didn't talk about the case for the first time in 3 days. Oliver had sent a drawing with Mrs. Henderson's daughter, who had ridden by the boarding house with a message about Oliver's status. The drawing was of 3 figures in front of a house, rendered in the earnest, approximate way of a 5-year-old who has strong feelings about representation but limited control of the medium. One figure was clearly taller than the other 2. One was medium, one was small, and the small one had been given what appeared to be an enormous hat, which Oliver had noted on the back was "me with my hat," in Mrs. Henderson's handwriting because Oliver couldn't yet spell. Nathan had the drawing on the table next to his plate. He picked it up once during dinner and looked at it and put it back down without saying anything, but his face did something that Evelyn registered and kept to herself. "He draws you with the same height as the house," she observed. "He thinks I'm very tall," Nathan said. "I've tried to disabuse him of this." "Have you tried very hard?" He almost smiled. "Not very." She looked at the drawing. "The medium figure," she said. "Is that me or Walter?" Nathan picked it up and looked at it more carefully. "I think it might be George," he said. Evelyn laughed. It was not a performed laugh, not the social laugh she'd learned in Victor's house. It came out of her without warning, a real laugh, the kind that takes you by surprise. And Nathan looked up from the drawing with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something that was unguarded in the way faces are only unguarded when something catches them off balance. He looked away first. "We should sleep," he said. "Long drive tomorrow." "Yes," she agreed. But neither of them moved immediately. The drawing sat on the table between them, 3 imprecise figures in front of a house that had been there before any of them and would need to still be there on the other side of what was coming. The fire in the boarding house dining room burned lower. Outside, Billings went about its evening, indifferent and busy and entirely unaware that in 3 weeks, a courtroom 2 blocks away was going to be the place where a woman's 2 lost years either became something that could be accounted for or disappeared entirely into the version of events that a powerful man had been building since December. Evelyn picked up the drawing and handed it back to Nathan, and he took it and folded it and put it in his coat pocket, close in, the way you carry the things you're not willing to lose. The second week of January came in cold and clear, the kind of Montana winter morning that had no sympathy for what people needed from it. Nathan had been awake since before 4. He hadn't slept well. He'd slept in the particular insufficient way of someone whose body goes through the motions of rest without delivering the result. Lying in the dark, listening to the house settle and the wind do its work outside, and his own thoughts moving in circles that didn't resolve into anything useful. He'd gotten up at 4:30 and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window in the dark and watched the yard take shape as the sky lightened by degrees, which was something he'd done on hard mornings his whole adult life. It didn't help exactly, but it gave him somewhere to put himself while the hard thing got closer. Evelyn was up by 5. She came into the kitchen without speaking, poured coffee, and stood at the other end of the window. They watched the yard together in the early gray light, and the silence between them was the particular silence of two people who have said everything that can be said about a thing and are now simply waiting for the thing to happen. Oliver was still asleep. He'd been back from the Hendersons for 2 weeks, and those 2 weeks had been the closest thing to normal that the ranch had seen since December. Oliver going about his 5-year-old business, Evelyn and Nathan preparing for court, while outwardly maintaining the shape of a functioning household, everyone managing the suspension of knowing that something large was coming without letting the knowing of it contaminate every ordinary hour. Oliver was resilient in the unconscious way of children who are loved and fed and given enough room. He didn't know the details of what was happening, and he didn't need to. He knew Evelyn was here. He knew his father was busy. He knew that when he showed Evelyn the way George the horse sometimes did a particular thing with his ears when he was annoyed, she paid attention and asked follow-up questions, which in Oliver's economy was the highest form of respect. Mrs. Henderson had agreed to come and stay with him today. She arrived at 6:30, stomping snow from her boots at the door, bringing a pie she'd made the evening before, because that was how she handled situations she couldn't fix directly. Nathan let her in and thanked her, and she looked at him in the particular way of a woman who has known a person for years and can read the specific quality of their difficulty without requiring it to be explained. "You'll be all right," she said. It wasn't a prediction. It was a statement of intent, the way strong women in difficult places say things they mean to be true by saying them. "Yes," Nathan said. He didn't know if he believed it, but he knew she'd said it for a reason. The district courthouse in Billings was a 2-story building that smelled of wood oil and cold air and the accumulated paper of many years of human dispute. Penn was already there when Nathan and Evelyn arrived, standing in the corridor outside the courtroom with his coat still on, going through papers with the focused speed of a man running a last-minute inventory. He looked up when he saw them, assessed them in a glance, and appeared satisfied with whatever he saw. "Agnes is here," he said. "Walter arrived last night. I've spoken with both of them this morning, and they're ready." He paused. "Blackwood's people are already inside. Creel brought 2 associates. They're well prepared." "Of course they are," Evelyn said. "Are you?" Penn asked her directly. She met his eyes. "Yes." Penn nodded. He looked at Nathan. "Your testimony is straightforward. You tell the truth in the order it happened, and you don't editorialize. The jury in this proceeding is the judge, not 12 people, and Judge Harlan is a man who respects facts presented without decoration. Give him facts." "Understood," Nathan said. "One more thing," Penn said. He looked at them both. "Creel is going to try to make this about the 2 of you, about what this," he gestured between them, "looks like to an outside observer. A widow coming to live in a widower's house. He'll use it to reinforce the instability argument, the idea that Evelyn left a respectable marriage to pursue something inappropriate. Don't react to it. Don't explain it. Let me handle it." Evelyn's jaw had tightened slightly. Nathan saw it. "Understood," she said. They went inside. Victor Blackwood was already seated at the table to the left when they entered, and Evelyn saw him before she'd fully processed the rest of the room. She had known he would be here. She had prepared for this. She had literally sat in Penn's office and said he manages rooms. He's practiced at it, and prepared herself for the specific experience of being in the same room with him again. None of that preparation turned out to matter very much the moment it was actually happening. He looked the same. That was the first thing. She had somehow expected him to look different, diminished or exposed or marked in some visible way by what he'd done. He looked exactly the same, well-dressed in the unhurried way of a man who has never once had to think about whether he could afford the clothes he wanted, and composed with the particular composure that was his most consistent feature, the composure of someone who has decided that events exist to be managed rather than experienced. He did not look at her when she came in. That was deliberate. She understood it as deliberate the way you understand a chess move as deliberate. He was establishing that her entrance was not an event that required his acknowledgement, that she was something happening in the periphery of his attention. She sat down next to Penn and looked straight ahead and felt Nathan settle into the chair to her left, and the weight of him there, the specific, solid presence of him, was something she held on to without letting herself think too much about it. Judge Harlan came in, and the room stood and then sat, and the proceeding began. Creel opened for Blackwood. He was a tall man with the silver hair of someone who had calculated that silver hair was an asset in a courtroom and had been right. He spoke with the measured cadence of practiced authority, the rhythm of someone who had learned long ago that a certain pace of speech made people assume the content was more substantial than it might be. He told a story. It was not the same story Evelyn would have told, which was the point. In Creel's story, Victor Blackwood was a devoted husband who had watched his wife struggle with periods of instability over the course of their marriage. He had been patient. He had been supportive. He had engaged physicians. Creel had documents here, who had treated Mrs. Blackwood for conditions relating to nervous episodes. On the night of December the 8th, Mrs. Blackwood had experienced such an episode and had fled the family home in a state of distress, putting herself in serious danger. Mr. Blackwood had been frantic with worry. He had sent men to search for her. He had been deeply relieved to learn she had reached safety and had reached out immediately and with complete reasonableness to arrange for her return. What Mr. Walker had chosen to do with that request was, Creel suggested with a particular inflection of regret, perhaps understandable from a human perspective, but legally and ethically complicated. He had harbored a married woman. He had facilitated her resistance to her husband's lawful efforts to care for her. And given certain aspects of the situation, here a very brief, significant pause, one might understand why a lonely man in a remote location might find it in his interest to do so. Nathan felt Evelyn's hand under the table, close briefly into a fist and then release. Penn rose. What Penn did was not dramatic. He did not match Creel's rhetorical gravity or try to outperform him. He simply began presenting evidence, and he presented it in the order he'd planned. And the order was deliberate in the way that good arguments are deliberate, each piece placed so that the next piece could rest on it. He started with the letters. Not with the story of the letters. With the letters themselves, which he had mounted carefully and which Agnes had identified in her written statement as letters she had personally witnessed being withheld from the outgoing post on multiple occasions. Letters in Evelyn's handwriting addressed to Nathan Walker, with dates. He entered them into the record one by one. He asked the clerk to read the dates into the record. The dates covered a span of 11 months. Creel objected. Penn addressed the objection. Judge Harlan, who had a face that communicated nothing useful about his conclusions, sustained some of the objections and overruled others and made notes. Then Penn called Agnes. Agnes sat in the witness chair with the careful posture of a woman who is not accustomed to courtrooms and is determined not to let that show. She answered Penn's questions in the direct, specific way she had answered them in his office, with dates when she had them, with careful qualification when she didn't, with the consistent reliability of someone who had been keeping notes for a reason and whose notes matched her testimony in every particular. She described the post room in the Blackwood house. She described watching Blackwood's foreman remove items from the outgoing mail on multiple occasions. She described a specific conversation she had overheard in which Blackwood had given instructions about correspondence from the Walker Ranch. What to do with it if it arrived, how to ensure it didn't reach Mrs. Blackwood. She had written this conversation in her notebook within an hour of hearing it. Penn entered the notebook page into evidence. Creel cross-examined her for 20 minutes. He questioned her memory, her motives, the reliability of notes taken by a domestic employee who had left the household under circumstances. What circumstances? Penn objected and sustained. Creel pushed at the edges of her credibility with the professional persistence of a man who understood that if he couldn't break the testimony, he could at least blur it. Agnes did not blur. She had the particular stubbornness of someone who has been waiting a long time to say true things in a context where they counted, and Creel's pressure seemed to compact that stubbornness rather than erode it. She answered what she was asked. She said, "I don't know when she didn't know. She said, I know what I saw 3 times in 3 different ways, and each time it landed the same." Then Penn called Walter Hayes. Walter looked worse than Nathan remembered, which was probably fair. He had the diminished quality of a man who has been living with something that doesn't agree with him, and the month since he'd left the ranch had not been kind to his face. He sat in the witness chair and looked once at Nathan and then away, and Nathan looked back without expression because there was nothing on his face that would have helped either of them. Penn took Walter through it methodically. The timeline of Nathan's correspondence with Evelyn, the way the letters had come in, the frequency of them, the fact that the whole ranch had known Nathan was waiting for someone to arrive, the day the letters from Evelyn stopped, and how Nathan had taken that. Then, the 2 letters that had come after. "You were at the post office when those letters arrived?" Penn asked. "Yes," Walter said. "And what did you do with them?" Walter's jaw moved. "I kept them. I read them, and then I burned them." The room was quiet. Judge Harlan made a note. "Why?" Penn asked, simply. "Because—" Walter stopped. Tried again. "Because Nathan was already a long way down from when the letters stopped. He'd told Oliver there was going to be someone coming. He'd made plans. And when it just stopped, with no explanation, it hit him hard. I thought if there was a letter saying she'd ended up with someone else, even under pressure, that it was better for him not to know than to know." "And the content of the letters? What did they say?" "The first one said she'd been stopped, that a man named Blackwood had arranged things so she couldn't get to Montana. She said she was trying to find a way out of it, and she was still coming." Walter said this without looking anywhere in particular. "The second one was shorter. She said she had been married, but that it wasn't what it looked like, and she was going to try to write until she found a way to get the letters through. But Nathan Walker never received those letters." "No." "Because you burned them." "Yes." Penn let that sit in the room for a moment. Then, "Did you know, at the time you burned those letters, that the woman writing them was describing a coerced marriage? That she was describing a situation in which she had been deliberately prevented from honoring a commitment she had made to your employer?" Walter looked at his hands. "I understood that was what she was saying." "And you chose not to tell him?" "I chose not to tell him." Penn had no further questions. Creel's cross-examination of Walter was brief, because there was not much useful Creel could do with a witness who had confirmed the core of the opposing argument. He established that Walter had no direct knowledge of Blackwood's operations in Helena. He established that Walter's decision had been personal and had not been made in coordination with Blackwood or anyone connected to him. These were true things, and they were the best Creel could do with them. Walter left the stand without looking at Nathan again. Nathan watched him sit down at the back of the room and did not feel what he'd expected to feel, which was the residual anger he'd been carrying since the morning in the barn. What he felt instead was something more tired and more complicated. The feeling of looking at a person who had done a wrong thing for reasons that were genuinely human, and understanding that both parts of that were true simultaneously, and that neither part canceled the other. Then it was Evelyn's turn. She walked to the witness chair the way she walked everywhere now, with the deliberate, unhurried quality of someone who has decided that her posture is information, that the way she moves through a room is something she is no longer willing to leave to chance. She sat down. She looked at Penn. She did not look at Victor Blackwood. Penn took her through the full account. He was slow and careful about it, building it the way he'd built everything else, in sequence, with dates, with the specific details that resist generalization. The advertisement in the St. Louis Register, the months of correspondence, the plans she'd made, the bag she'd packed, the 3 days she'd had left before departure, Blackwood's appearance in her father's shop and the paperwork he'd brought with him, the 48 hours he'd given her and what he'd told her would happen if she refused. She answered in the same register she'd written her account in, precise, specific, unsentimental. She didn't perform distress. She described things that were distressing and let the description carry the weight, which was more effective and which was also, Nathan thought watching her, simply who she was. She didn't reach for effect. She reached for accuracy. When Penn asked her about the night she left, she described it the way she had described it to Nathan in front of the fire weeks ago. The timing of the guard rotation, the 4-minute gap she'd calculated, the social function that had taken Blackwood to Helena. She described the window, the drop, the field, the road. "Why did you walk toward the Walker Ranch specifically?" Penn asked. "Because I had memorized the return address on every letter Nathan Walker ever sent me," she said. "And because the person who had written those letters was the only person in Montana whose address I knew, and I had spent 2 years believing, rightly as it turned out, that he was the kind of man who would not turn a woman away from his door in December." "And was he?" "No," she said. "He was not." Penn sat down. Creel rose. Creel was good. Nathan had to acknowledge that. He moved through his cross-examination with the patience of a man who understood he was playing a long game and that each small insertion of doubt was worth something even if no single one was decisive. He questioned the timeline. Was she certain of the dates? He questioned the letters Agnes had retrieved. Was it not possible that these had been withheld for reasons other than Blackwood's direction, that the household management of mail was handled by staff with some discretion? He circled back to the physician's documents he'd entered earlier. There was documented treatment, there was documented consultation, and wasn't it true that these visits had been voluntary? "Were your medical consultations voluntary?" Creel asked. "The first one was presented to me as a social call to a friend of my husband's," Evelyn said. "I was not told I was being taken to a physician until we arrived. When I refused to participate in the examination, I was told that whether or not I cooperated, the documentation of the visit would reflect that I had." A small silence. "So your answer to whether it was voluntary," Creel began. "My answer is what I said," Evelyn said. Judge Harlan made a note. Creel moved to the question of the Walker Ranch. He asked about the living arrangements. He asked them carefully, in the way of a man inserting implications through the shape of questions rather than their content. Penn objected to the line twice and was sustained twice, but Creel had already gotten what he was after. The question hanging in the air, the implication present even without an answer. Then Evelyn said something Penn had not prepared her to say. "May I respond to the implication rather than the question?" she asked Judge Harlan. Harlan looked at her over his glasses. "You may." "Nathan Walker is a man I wrote letters to for 6 months and never met until I arrived at his property in December," she said. "He gave me shelter and he is fighting this case at his own considerable expense. I will not characterize our current arrangement as anything it isn't, and I won't allow it to be characterized as anything it isn't by someone else. What it is this. A woman is living in a house with a man who believes she deserves the right to make her own choices. I am not aware that this requires further explanation in a court of law." The room was very quiet for a moment. Nathan was looking at the table in front of him, and something in his chest was doing something he didn't have a clean word for. Creel recovered professionally and moved on. But the moment had a particular density that persisted in the room after he'd moved past it, the way certain things said clearly in public spaces don't entirely dissipate. Penn made his closing argument in the methodical way he did everything. Not brilliantly, not with the kind of rhetorical performance that made people remember phrases afterward, but with the accumulated weight of evidence laid out in sequence, so that each piece pointed to the same conclusion, and the conclusion was not easy to argue with. He said, "A woman who walks barefoot through a Montana winter in a wedding dress is not confused. She is not unstable. She is not experiencing an episode requiring medical supervision. She is a person who has evaluated her situation and decided that frostbite and exposure are preferable to remaining in it, and that decision tells you everything you need to know about what the situation was." He said, "The letters prove that what happened to Evelyn Whitmore was not the result of her own choices. Her choices were taken from her methodically and over time by a man who understood that choice requires information and who controlled her information the way you control a room's temperature, slowly, so the person inside doesn't notice until it's already too cold to think clearly." He said, "Nathan Walker did not harbor a fugitive. He picked a woman up off a frozen road and brought her inside. The law has not yet criminalized basic human decency, and he would suggest to the court that it should not begin doing so today." Creel's closing was polished and legally precise and rested primarily on the argument that the petition before the court was a domestic matter, and that the documented medical record of treatment established that Evelyn had received care within the marriage that she was refusing. Judge Harlan did not rule from the bench. He said he would have a decision in 5 days. 5 days. They drove back to the ranch in the afternoon with the low winter sun behind them, and neither of them said much. And the not saying was not comfortable this time in the way it had sometimes been. It was the not saying of two people who have expended everything they had and are now in the particular hollow that follows effort, waiting for something outside their control. Nathan fed the horses when they got home. Evelyn made supper. Oliver ate and told them about what Mrs. Henderson's youngest had said that day, which was apparently very significant, and both of them listened and responded appropriately. And Oliver went to bed without detecting that anything was wrong, which was a small mercy that they were both grateful for. After Oliver was asleep, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of tea that had gone cold, and Nathan stood at the window. The fire was good. The house was warm. Outside, the cold pressed on in its indifferent way. "You weren't supposed to say that," Nathan said. She looked up. He was still looking out the window. "In court," he said, "what you said about the arrangement, Penn didn't have that in the plan." "I know. It was right, though." He turned from the window. "What you said." She looked at her cup. "I was tired of letting Creel's questions mean things they weren't supposed to mean. Sometimes the best response to an implication is to name it and make it boring." "Is that what you were doing?" "Partly," she said honestly. He came and sat down across from her, the way they sat at this table most evenings, the table that had become the geography of most of the important conversations they'd had. He looked at her for a moment in the way he looked at things he was deciding about. "What happens," he said carefully, "if Harlan rules against us?" She had been waiting for this question. She had been thinking about it since the drive home. "Penn appeals," she said. "It takes longer and costs more, and the ranch is mortgaged and we're in a harder position. But we appeal. And if the appeal fails, then we find another ground and we file again." She said this without drama, because drama wasn't what the question needed. "I'm not going back, Nathan. That's the only thing I'm certain of. Everything else, the timeline, the cost, the path, I can adapt to whatever it is. But I'm not going back." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know, I'll fight it as long as it needs fighting." "I know," she said. "That's not a small thing." "It's the least small thing I know how to do right now," he said simply. She looked at him. At this man who had mortgaged his ranch and fired his friend and driven to Billings twice in the winter, and sat in a courtroom listening to his own private grief used as a legal argument, and who had done all of it without once making her feel that it was something she owed him for. The absence of that, of the keeping of score, of the expectation of return, was something she had not known she was waiting for until she was already inside it, and she thought that might be the hardest kind of thing to recognize. The thing you needed that you couldn't name until someone was already providing it. "I have something to tell you," she said, "and I want to say it now, before the ruling, so you'll know it wasn't affected by the outcome." He waited. "When I was walking toward your address in December," she said, "I wasn't walking toward safety. I want you to understand that. I didn't know if you were there. I didn't know if you'd believe me. I didn't know if I'd make it." She looked at her hands. "I was walking toward the only thing I knew the address of, and what I found when I got there was considerably more than what I thought I was walking toward." She stopped. The fire made its small sounds. "I want you to know that," she said, "whatever happens." Nathan was quiet. He had the stillness he got when something had landed in a place he hadn't expected, when the ground turned out to be different from what he'd mapped. "I don't know what to do with that," he said finally, meaning it honestly, not deflecting. "You don't have to do anything with it," she said. "I just needed to say it." He looked at her. "All right," he said. And then after a moment, "I'm glad you walked toward it." It wasn't more than that, but it was exactly enough. Judge Harlan's ruling came on a Thursday morning, delivered by courier to Penn's office, who sent his man to the ranch with it before noon. Penn had written a cover note of 2 sentences. "The ruling is in our favor. Call on me next week to discuss next steps." Evelyn read the ruling itself, which was 12 pages of legal language that said, in its sustained and specific way, what Penn's 2 sentences had already said. The marriage had been contracted under conditions of documented coercion. The evidence established a pattern of deliberate interference with Mrs. Whitmore's ability to make free choices before, during, and after the marriage. The petition for return was denied. The marriage was dissolved. She read it at the kitchen table. Nathan sat across from her. Oliver was outside with the horses, doing whatever 5-year-olds did with horses that were not nice, presumably talking to George about his ears. When she finished, she put the ruling down on the table. "It's over," Nathan said. "This part is over," she said, because she was a realistic person who had learned the cost of assuming that the end of one thing was the end of all related things. The appeal. "Penn thinks Blackwood won't appeal," she said. "The ledger. The names." Penn told him, through Creel, that what we knew about the ledger would come out in any further proceeding. He thinks Blackwood will calculate that the cost of continuing outweighs the cost of letting go. Nathan was quiet. "Will he be right?" "I think Victor will spend 6 months being angry about it and then find something else to occupy his attention," she said. "He's a man who moves to the next acquisition. I was an acquisition that didn't work out. Eventually he'll stop caring." She paused. "That's not as satisfying as it should be, but it's probably what happens." It was the truth, and they both knew it. There wasn't a version of this where Victor Blackwood was publicly ruined and formally held to account for everything he'd done, where the names in the ledger were brought into the light and the whole architecture of his arrangements was dismantled. That was not the story. The story was that a judge in Billings had looked at the evidence and called the marriage what it was, and Evelyn was free, and the rest of Victor Blackwood's life was going to continue in most of its existing dimensions, because that was how it worked when powerful men ran into limits. They found the boundary, and they backed up to it, and they went around. Evelyn had spent enough time being angry about this to understand that the anger was legitimate and that it was also not useful beyond a certain point. The useful thing was what came next. What came next took months and was not simple and did not resolve into anything clean or tied. The mortgage on the ranch was a problem that had a solution, but the solution required work and time and the kind of sustained daily effort that doesn't make for dramatic storytelling, but is the actual substance of how things get built. Evelyn stayed. She stayed because she chose to, which was the part that mattered. There was no obligation, no debt, no arrangement that required her presence on the Walker property, and she had made very sure in her own mind that she was clear on this before she chose. She learned ranching with the same systematic attention she had applied to the guard rotation and the window drop and the timing of a 4-minute gap. She was not naturally skilled at it in the physical way Nathan was, the way of someone who had grown up with land. But she was competent in the way of someone who learns by watching carefully and doesn't pretend to know things she doesn't know yet, and doesn't stop when something is hard. By spring, she could handle most of what the ranch required when Nathan was occupied elsewhere. By summer, she was teaching Oliver to help her, which Oliver approached with a seriousness that suggested he had been waiting for this opportunity. Penn worked out an arrangement for the mortgage that was manageable, not comfortable, the difference between a weight you can carry and one that holds you still. And Nathan carried it without complaint, which was his way with most things. Agnes had gone back to Missoula. Evelyn wrote to her. Agnes wrote back. The letters were not effusive. They were both women who had been made practical by the circumstances of their lives. But they were consistent, and consistency was its own form of warmth. She did not hear from Walter Hayes. She hadn't expected to. The story had run in 2 papers, in the end, the Gazette piece, and one in Helena that had picked up the story after the ruling. Victor Blackwood did not appear to have responded publicly to either. Creel had sent Penn a terse professional communication indicating his client did not intend to pursue further legal action. Penn had acknowledged this and thanked him with the professional courtesy of a man who had expected nothing less and was not inclined to gloat. The county commissioner, whose name Evelyn had memorized from the ledger, resigned from his position in March, citing personal reasons. This was reported in the Helena paper without particular fanfare. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table and showed it to Nathan, and neither of them said much about it, because there was not much to say. It was a small thing in the margin of a larger thing that would continue in its slow way without them. Nathan asked her to marry him in September, on a Tuesday, which was not a notable day in any other respect. They were mending the north fence, finally, the north fence, which had been unrepaired since December, and which Nathan had been pushing back for 9 months because there was always something more urgent. And it was the kind of September afternoon that Montana offers occasionally, as if an apology for what it does the rest of the year. Clear and golden and warm without the heat of summer. And Oliver was helping in the way of a 5-year-old helping, which meant he was present and enthusiastic and occasionally in the way. Nathan was holding a fence post and Evelyn was working the wire, and he said without particular build-up, "I want to ask you something." "Then ask it," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not "will you marry me" with the inflection of a formal occasion, just "will you marry me?" The way he said other direct things. She looked up at him from the wire. He was looking back at her with the expression she had come to know as his honest face. Not the composed public face, not the careful face he wore when he was managing a situation, but the face where the caution dropped, and you could see what was actually happening in there. "Why?" she asked. He considered this seriously, the way she'd wanted him to. "Because I spent 2 years thinking about someone I'd never met, and then I met her. And she turned out to be worth everything the 2 years cost," he said. "And because Oliver has already decided you're staying, and if we don't make it official, he'll consider that an oversight." She almost smiled. "Those are 2 very different reasons." "Yes, both true." She looked at the fence wire in her hands. She thought about the letter she'd written in the first week at the ranch, the account Penn had needed, the part where she'd had to put in plain language what 2 years of a controlled life had taken from her. She thought about the morning she'd finished writing it, and looked at what was on the paper and understood that she had survived all of it. Not intact, not unchanged, not without the particular permanent alterations that hard things make in people, but present. Still herself. Still capable of this moment on a September afternoon with fence wire in her hands and a man asking her a direct question. "Yes," she said, simply, because it was the simple answer, and she had learned the hard way that simple, honest things were worth more than complicated, careful ones. Oliver, who had heard the exchange from 3 feet away where he was supposedly occupied with a fence stake, said, "Does this mean Evelyn is going to be my mother?" "Do you want her to be?" Nathan asked him. Oliver looked at Evelyn with the direct appraisal of a child taking a question seriously. "Yes," he said. "She listens when I talk about George." "High standards," Evelyn said. "They are," Oliver agreed. Nathan caught her eye over Oliver's head, and his expression did the thing it sometimes did, the thing she had stopped trying to name exactly, the unguarded thing, the thing that happened when he wasn't performing anything. She thought she probably wore a similar expression, though she couldn't see herself. The wedding was in November, in the front room of the Walker Ranch, which was the only room large enough for the people who came. Penn came. The Hendersons came. 2 neighboring ranch families came. Agnes wrote that she could not travel from Missoula in November, but sent a letter that said more in a page than most people managed in an hour of talking. It was not a beautiful ceremony in the produced sense. The room was cold because the house took time to heat, and Oliver fell asleep in Mrs. Henderson's lap halfway through, which everyone found more charming than disruptive. And the judge who officiated got 2 of the words in the declaration slightly wrong and apologized and said them again correctly. Evelyn wore a dark green dress she had made herself over the course of October, stitched in the evenings at the kitchen table with the same practical attention she brought to everything, and it fit her well because she had made it to fit her and not someone else's idea of her, which seemed right. There were no great pronouncements. No one said anything that resolved into a memorable phrase. What happened was ordinary in the way that the most important things tend to be. People in a room saying what they meant, in front of witnesses who mattered to them. Afterward, someone brought out a bottle that was better than expected, and there was food that the Henderson women had made with the generous excess of people who express caring through quantities. And Oliver woke up and ate cake and announced to no one in particular that he had always wanted a family dinner with more people. Nathan stood beside Evelyn, and she stood beside Nathan, and at some point in the evening she became aware that she was not monitoring the room. The way she had monitored rooms for 2 years, not cataloging exits, not running contingency calculations, not measuring the distance between herself and the nearest door. She was just standing in it, present, not waiting for the shape of the situation to turn hostile. That was the thing about freedom that she hadn't known to expect. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like a door opening. It felt like noticing, one ordinary evening, that you had stopped bracing for the door to close. She had walked 4 miles in December with no shoes on, and she had not done it because she was brave in any mythological sense. And she had not done it because she knew where she was going. She had done it because the alternative was remaining in a place that had been made for her by someone else, shaped around her, closed at every edge. And she had understood that even the uncertainty of the road was preferable to the certainty of that room. What she had found at the end of the road was not rescue. It was a starting point, a cold ranch and a man who asked direct questions, and a 5-year-old who wanted to tell her about a horse's ears, and the long, unspectacular, sometimes difficult work of building something from a starting point. She had learned that freedom was not given. It was not handed to you by a judge's ruling or a court's decision, though those things mattered and had cost real things to obtain. It was chosen, daily, in the ordinary decisions, to say the honest thing, to do the hard work, to stay when staying was chosen, and leave when leaving was necessary, and know the difference. She had been made smaller for 2 years by someone who understood that a person's range of motion could be reduced gradually until they stopped noticing the edges. What she had recovered was not what she'd had before. She didn't have the particular unexamined freedom of someone who has never had it taken. What she had was something different, freedom that she had looked at directly, that she knew the cost of, that she had chosen in the specific knowledge of what the alternative was. That was not a small thing. It was perhaps the only thing worth having. Outside the Walker Ranch, November was doing what November did in Montana, pressing the cold down from the mountains with patient, inhuman persistence. Inside, the fire was good, the room was warm. Oliver had cake on his face, and Mrs. Henderson was telling someone a story that made 3 people laugh at once. And Nathan's hand found Evelyn's in the ordinary way of 2 people who have simply decided that this is where they are, and she held on to it, and the night went on.